Hey, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brendan Goss. I'm the Senior Innovation and Accelerator Manager in Tangent in Trinity College Dublin. Tangent is the university's Innovation and Entrepreneurship Centre. It's where we do innovation and entrepreneurship. Um, but we have a couple of different strands. The two primary ones are around education and entrepreneurship. And within education, we run a lot of postgraduate certificate programs mostly addressed to people who are in the continuous professional development space or looking for new qualifications as they pursue their careers. But also, we have programs for undergraduates as well. And on the entrepreneurship side, which is where I'm largely focused, we work with a lot of startups, corporate partners, state agencies as well, in terms of imbuing the spirit and philosophies of entrepreneurship in those businesses, helping them to develop commercially and helping them to build networks primarily across Europe, not just nationally but internationally. So, what one of the reasons that we're meeting here today is because one of our education programs is a postgraduate certificate in the creative and cultural entrepreneurship space. And what we've decided to do is because we have a bit of skin in the game now, invited a couple of noteworthy stakeholders from different disciplines in the creative industries, and we're going to debate what creative industry actually means now shortly. But I'm delighted to introduce you today to Hugh Farley, who is the director of the Irish Writers Guild and a TV and film director by profession.
Hello.
Gwen Cunningham of NCAD and I suppose the Creative Futures Academy. Is that correct, Gwen?
Yep.
Yeah, because there's been a kind of an evolution of titles and institutional activity in that space. And you've got a long kind of working title, which I'll let you present to the public at large. And Michael Moore, who's got an even longer one. In actual fact, Michael uses A4 for his business cards. Michael is a researcher and reader in ceramics and fine arts in the University of Ulster, but a well-established ceramicist in his own right, producing his own work and exhibiting his own work over the last, what, 30 years?
30 years. Yeah.
You're looking well for it,
Thank
Michael.
you. Thank you.
So we have Jean Lecour here, who's my colleague in Tangent as well, and she will be acting as gatekeeper to any of you who become a little bit too exuberant. But if you do feel the need to express yourselves, there's a chat box for questions. So what we'll do is we'll kind of gently career down this debate about what exactly a creative and cultural industry is. And if you have any questions you'd like to ask, I'd invite you to put them into the chat box, and we'll come to them in about half an hour's time or so. What I'm going to do is first of all quickly ask each of our participants, each of our panelists, to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about themselves. Gwen, I might ask you first. Tell us a little bit about yourself, what you're doing, where you've come from, and where you're going.
Oh, wow. In how long? How long do I have?
As long as you like.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. And I'm really curious about the conversation and where it's going to bring us today. So Gwen, as you mentioned, I've recently started a new role at NCAD as the lead for sustainability and circularity, which is a new position within the college that's basically aiming to kind of reorientate the curriculum to embed this topic into everything they offer and also develop a whole new suite of programs in that space. My own background is in design, so I trained and worked as a fashion designer, trained actually in NCAD way back when. But it was quite early on in my kind of career that I started to have a little bit of a crisis of faith, an existential crisis, perhaps, understanding the reality of the industry that I was about to enter into, in terms of the environmental impact and the social impact that pertains to textiles and fashion. So maybe for those who aren't aware, because it's still somehow not that commonly discussed, but it is one of the most pollutive and wasteful industries in the world. It's also, of course, one of the most lucrative and creative and consumer facing, but it has a lot to answer for. So if you look, globally, we're producing 100 billion new items of clothing every year. We're using those clothes for less and less time. So utilization is drastically nosediving. Compared to 15 years ago, we keep our clothes for half as long as we used to. And then we have a huge issue at the whole end of life stage of textiles. So about 75 to 85% of all textiles globally goes to landfill or incineration, and only 1% of textiles is actually being recycled back into new textiles. So this was a bit of a horror story to realize when you're at that age where you're launching into your career path and you have to decide, you know, do I stay and do I try and change things from within, or do I find another route? And I decided to stay. I moved to Amsterdam, where I've worked for the last 10 years, and started to work in this field of sustainability and circularity, and essentially kind of ask the question, you know, is there a different way of organizing this system of fashion, and what would that look like? And so ever since then, I've been working with industry to try and kind of change their practices all along the value chain. So a lot of the work has been in developing new technology and infrastructure to enable, for instance, collection, sortation, repair, reuse, recycling at scale. But also then as soon as you're, you know, knee deep in textile waste and trying to find solutions for this waste, you realize the impact that the design has in the first instance. You know, the fact that we don't produce product to have any kind of circular future. And that's inherent, I think, to the way a lot of designers are taught today. You know, you're taught to think up until the point of sale, and you're taught to think primarily from a point of aesthetics and beauty and desirability. And no one really ever says to you, okay, but who's going to use this product? For how long? Under what circumstances? What happens to it when it gets broken? What happens to it when it reaches its eventual end of life? So that really, you know, is probably about 6 years into being really deep in kind of the supply chain and the end of use side of things that I realized that my role as a designer was coming back into focus, and that we also had to train up designers to think in this way, to use better materials, but also to design for cyclability, to design for durability, and so on. And so we started to train up designers, so working with large multinationals all around the world and training their design teams in this topic. And then you realize, well, it's not good enough to just upskill the current industry professionals, but we also need to integrate this into education and the next generation. What led me back to education in the end, kind of, I suppose, right the wrong. You know, the fact that I had to have this realization in my own time when I was training to be a designer. I think it should be absolutely central to all fashion and textile education and design education in general. Because I'm a big believer that designers are key to the transition, you know, that we have huge power and responsibility. It's about 80% of the environmental footprint of a product, and the economic cost of a product is determined at the design stage. So everything that you decide in terms of color, material composition, you know, structure, format, all of that is already locking in all of these impacts. But unless you're aware of that, you know, you're not going to be able to make the right decisions at that moment in time. So yeah, that's a little bit of my journey. I'm still straddling kind of both of those worlds. So I'm still working with industry across Europe, and more also in the global south and in North America, and then also working here with designers. And just this week, actually, we are announcing that we're launching a master's in design for the circular economy at NCAD, which is really exciting. So really hoping to give people that opportunity here on the island to specialize and build up that deep knowledge and expertise.
Fantastic. No, brilliant. No, there's just a compelling story there that needs to be expanded upon and brought more into kind of central discourse about, you know, consumerism and how we tell the difference between an industry and an industry-led occupation or profession, if you like, but also the responsibility we have of citizens in terms of the types of jobs and professions that we undertake. Hugh, tell us about yourself. Give us a little bit of background. Try and outdo Gwen there in terms of the breadth of activity she's currently involved with. Sure.
Well, thank you very much, Brendan. Actually, talking about me is my least favorite occupation, so I'm going to be really brief about me and then try and delve into a more interesting thing, which is anything that is not to do with me. I've been a writer, director, and producer on and off for about 34 years, and I work principally in television. And the screen industries in Ireland, as everybody is aware, have been very high profile this year because of the attention that has been focused on Irish talent, largely on-screen talent, at the award ceremonies around the last couple of months. And it's been a very exciting time. And within the industry, we're asking our questions, well, where do we go? What do we do with all of this? And in a certain sense, how did we get there? And, you know, I'm so fascinated by the way in which Gwen articulated her field of expertise and how her thinking has evolved, because I guess that having worked as a practitioner for many years, principally as a freelance, I became very frustrated about the failure of the screen industries to nurture and develop talent in any real way. So there is a theme here about sustainability too, but I define it in a different way. It's about the sustainability of investing in talent and in developing a cultural economy in a meaningful way. And through my role as director of the Writers Guild, I have an opportunity to represent and advocate on behalf of about 440 of our members to try to ensure that they are treated fairly on a contractual basis and that they are also being paid properly. This is I think, the big theme that I would love to touch on, and I'm sure it's a common thread that exists with all the contributors, which is that where does value, where in a cultural economy does value get created? And how much value do we put to it? Because essentially, you can say that if you're a visual artist, you create a piece of perhaps painted work or ceramic work or something, and you invest a certain amount of time and talent and experience in that, and over the years you acquire a reputation for your work, and it's displayed and purchased and so forth, and value is accrued directly. And essentially it's a very simple transaction between the maker of the art and the buyer of the art, and there's probably at least one intermediary who takes a commission, but the principal benefit of that is the visual artists themselves. In the case of the screen industries, it's much more complex. The underlying idea behind any film or television work is created by a writer, unless you're in an improvisational environment. And even at that, I mean, somebody like Mike Lee, who works principally through improvisation, would see himself as a screenwriter. I mean, he works extensively with actors, they do improvise, but then he guides it in a particular way and he writes the script that comes out of that improvisation. So can you say it's an improvisational work? No, he would, if he was here, he'd say, no, I'm a damn writer. I wrote the things that you saw, even if I had other creative collaborators in the process. Now, here's the thing. The fundamental idea and its expression is the screenplay. Through the process of production and post-production, that work changes and meets its final form. It is different in some respect, or to a greater or lesser degree, from the original script, but it largely resembles it. It's the blueprint for it, because work, particularly collaborative art, is about the accretion of the skills and experience of all the heads of departments and the artists who work on the production. They change it, it mutates in some sort of way. But the fundamental idea is that screenplay. Now, what's the value of that? The problem is that what's happening, and as people may be aware, is that the Writers Guild of America are on strike at the moment because the disruption in our industry that's been caused by the arrival of the streamers is they've come in with a new business model. There's a long established process of remuneration called residuals, where as the television product or the film makes revenue above a certain point, the artists are compensated for the success of the work. The new economic model that the streamers have brought in is they want to buy everything out. And they buy it out for a very small premium, about 108 to 112% of the total budget. So not a very substantial amount, but they get all rights in perpetuity for that work. So they would say that the value, they create value because they have a global digital network and they have the eyeballs of, what is it now, 500 million people. You know, we would say, well, none of that's based on the creative enterprise of the artist, like the writer and the director and the choreographer, the cinematographer, and certain other people who have created the work that people actually respond to. You know, it's the difference between the phone call and the telephone. You know, the problem is that we have, as a society, allowed these disruptors, the Ubers of this world, the Facebooks and these other digital economy people, to redefine the norms in a way that massively stacks the deck in their favor. So they aggregate masses and masses of profit, and they wish to return none of that. Not just a small percentage, and we are talking about a writer might get 2.5% traditionally of the producer's net, and the producer might get they might be on the wrong side of a 60-40 deal with a distributor. Now that's all wiped away. It's like, no, here's a sum of money and we want you to all go away. And we have to say at some point whether or not we are prepared to allow the cultural economy to be re-engineered to manufacture money, but to disadvantage and make it impractical for artists to live. And this is what we're seeing, is that our members are finding it harder and harder to earn enough money to stay in the game. Mm-hmm. There was a survey done about 3 or 4 years ago where the European rates of remuneration for directors and writers was assessed, and the average annual income was about 22,000 euros per year. I mean, they would earn more money working in a shop, to be quite honest, or working in many, many other spheres of activity. But culture and the people who create culture are not, for the most part, and of course there's certain people who are lionized, but the vast amount of the foot soldiers who make the content that you watch on a day-by-day basis simply don't earn a lot of money, and they're being asked to take less. So that is what I fight for on a daily basis.
Well, you've earned your corn, I think, Hugh, in the last 5 minutes on the Guild's behalf. But your point is very, very well made. And of course, you come from, despite the fact that the artistic genesis, if you like, often comes from the writer or the painter, and whatever it may be. But it's part of a larger collaborative process that, Michael, I think, from your perspective, might be a little bit the other end of the spectrum in terms of your background and your activity working in the ceramics space. Yeah. Now, separating a little bit from your academic day bread and butter stuff, in terms of your experience as a ceramicist, what have been, or how would you describe that kind of path that you've gone through in terms of discovering ceramics as an art form and then becoming a practitioner in that space, and why did you decide to do so?
Well, that's an enormous question. So thank you for that, Brendan. But well, I suppose I was sort of writing notes to myself here, and I'm going to jump around a little bit, but going back to Gwen's comments on sustainability, it is a factor in the ceramics. Perhaps less waste compared to the percentages, shocking percentages you were talking about. But we do essentially empty clay pits, and we have to look at how, and there are methods to repurpose materials. I suppose following on from Hugh's sort of outline or, kind of description of value, I found myself thinking of the Great Book of Ireland, which is part of a collaborative project I'm developing at the moment with Pembroke College in Cambridge, which is linking Ted Hughes to Seamus Heaney to Barry Cook. And we're just this weekend, colleagues were over in Belfast, and we were looking at that sort of value of the object beyond its monetary kind of element. Back to your question, Brendan, I always loved making. I really started with fishing, and fly fishing was the thing that I loved. And then I made flies, and when I was accepted into NCAD, the flies got me in because they could see I was a maker. And that led me to a material choice in ceramics, really thanks to the quality of the tutors. And I realized two things in making. One was that I like transformative materials, a material that has to go through a process to become itself. There's a recycling element there. And I also realized I had an interest in three-dimensional work. It was never easy. And sort of the important things for me over the years was to be involved in cultural and creative exchanges, as well as selling work. I had to sell work. I had to buy a kiln. I had to rent a studio, all those things that my graduates deal with. And I might touch on that in a second as well, because we've more kind of structural support for graduates than back in my day, and I'm very positive about that. But critically, as a maker, as an applied artist, as a potter, as a craftsperson, or a maker of useless, expensive objects, if I want to kind of provoke a response to people, it was all about international activity. It was all, and Brexit has been a huge problem for us in Belfast in terms of opportunities for students and graduates and PhD research and all this stuff. But it was engaging with ceramic industry, engaging with ceramic cultural institutions across Europe was really what made my career go from being just studio-based and Dublin-based or Belfast-based and out beyond that. Current projects I think I'd like to talk about, because post-COVID and during COVID, we had a massive uptake for community engagement projects in ceramics, especially in the areas of well-being and mental health, with cross-community groups in North Belfast, Crumlin Village in Dublin. I'm working with a church group there, and we've just landed a very large Ideas Fund UK grant to work with an intergenerational group in Derry, Londonderry, Strabane, Sion Mills area. And that, I suppose from the point of view of people who may be listening to this, that community engagement is somewhere where I'm seeing my graduates, parallel to their studio practice, being very productive and active. Lastly, going back to the sort of graduate situation we're putting in place, and I don't mean to be advertising anything here, I really don't, but what we're trying to do is put in place kind of transitional spaces and experiences for the graduates between their time in college and the professional workplace. And I think that's something that seems to be more and more critical, and certainly more demand for it, and it's more necessary maybe than when I graduated. So that would be it overall. So the work is research through studio practice, writing about research. A morning of grant writing is constant, but then that funds these interesting projects that engage with communities and engage with different generations and different parts of the world. That's it. Yeah.
I suppose the question that I'll ask all three of you to contribute to is the sense, which you'll all be familiar with, of the tension between what constitutes an occupation within the creative industry and a job. And I suppose it speaks a little bit, Hugh, to how you debate internally and externally the notion of value for a service. There's a common, I suppose, definition of the creative industries as being an occupation that contributes to the cultural heritage of a country. But equally, there's a tension there with how government perceives the creative industry to be, because its definition includes industries as diverse as architecture, software development, special effects in the animation and games industry, etc., etc. So culture, if you like, or the creative industry is becoming defined in a more nuanced way, almost like a kind of an applied industry, an applied creative force, as opposed to the slightly more purist or craft stroke occupational definition that we might be more familiar with around writing, design, any kind of craft around painting and so on and so forth. So how do you think that tension can be resolved, Gwen, in terms of how you impart that message about, number one, the importance of design from a cultural perspective, at least, if you take Ireland as an economy in its own right, but also then the need to kind of, as you say, imbue that sense of, particularly in your context, sustainability and circularity as that person goes forth into the workplace.
Mm. It's a complex question. I feel like you could talk about this for hours. I mean, it's for me, I always find it really striking that for myself, it's very confronting even for me to realize that I still identify as a designer. I still call myself a designer, even though it has been, I mean, I would be embarrassed to speak about the last time that I really felt that in, let's say, the traditional understanding of what it means to be a designer, and of course, if you describe to me the role I have today and the work I do week in, week out, at the moment when I decided to go into a design space and industry, I wouldn't have been able to understand the correlation between these two things, because on paper, it's not design work necessarily that I do anymore, but I do see it as design work. And actually, I really welcome the expansion of the definition of what it means to be a designer, and the fact that, there's a recognition that designers have a role to play in, for instance, policy making or business strategy or tech development. I see that as a really positive shift that's happening, because I think that it is fundamentally, a way of thinking, a way of problem solving. It's a way of imagining a different type of a world, and then being able to articulate and demonstrate what that alternative looks like through craft and through making. This is it, speaking very much from my perspective, I suppose, as kind of in the product design space. And I feel like there's a real revaluing of designers in all of these fields where we never had a seat at the table. And it's a difficult thing because, there's almost, if we come back to education, I still think education's very far behind in that sense, in terms of really, developing provisions that build out that specific type of capacity for designers who are able to slot into all of these new roles that are becoming available. But yeah, for me, it's been a kind of a relief almost to see that the shackles of designer equals producer or designer equals maker have kind of been loosened over the last while. And that's not to say, of course, that isn't also a really valid, kind of specialism within the design space.
Hugh, I know that you would have experienced that particular dichotomy or tension quite acutely in the film and TV game. On the one hand, as a writer, but on the other, sometimes as a producer as well. So your approach as a producer is slightly more nuanced from a commercial perspective.
Yeah.
And then you've got that internal struggle about how to appreciate and reward the writer and the contribution of the writer, or the director for that matter, and try to balance the two. So how have you done that over the years? How objective can you be?
It's a really interesting question.
Thank you very much.
It's a very fine question, which is my way of saying, oh, I think I know an answer to that one. Simply put, I think it's this. I think there is a really odd thing in our culture, not just within Irish culture, but I think in many other countries, this tension between whether to be an artist is to have a vocation or to have a profession. Well, I think it's a very unhelpful way to talk about artists as having a vocation. I think we understand that there's many areas of enterprise and society where people do have a calling to work in social work, or to be a teacher, or to go into government and public service. And all of those are driven by the same thing. However, in our culture, the vocation of the artist is very particular. An architect may have a vocation to go into their profession, but nobody would seriously say, having commissioned an architect to design a work on their behalf, they'd say, well, we don't really have the money for that, but you'd have to do it anyway, because you're a great artist. You have to express yourself. The idea that you should monetize that in a realistic way in the economy, particularly when we talk about fine arts, and to a certain degree within the screen industries, that's a very pernicious idea, is that to the extent that the Arts Council about 2 or 3 years ago initiated or launched a policy, #PayTheArtist, because simply people were not being paid. Actors were being asked to act in productions they weren't being paid for. Writers were being given next to nothing or nothing. I mean, for their work. We did our first survey of the earnings of screenwriters last year. We're just about to launch another one. And we discovered, whether it was theatre, radio, film, television, or animation, of the respondents, about a third to 40% were commissioned on work that they never got paid for. Scandalous. That's absolutely scandalous. And those that were remunerated were not particularly well remunerated. So this idea that if your career is as an artist, that artists, they're doing something which is pro bono, they are injecting something into the cultural life of the country, which we recognize. We recognize the value of Seamus Heaney's poetry, but Seamus Heaney was not a millionaire. Seamus Heaney lived a modest life, and he's a freaking Nobel laureate. It's not we somehow think that people who are engaged as an artist in different expressions simply need to provide this to the culture, but anytime that they attempt to seek reasonable or extraordinary remuneration because they have to be a brilliant artist, somehow that there's a narrative which comes out, which is they're greedy, that somehow or other they've overstepped themselves in a way that the CEO of some mega corporation who gets a huge bonus is not, apparently, because we value their skills far more in monetary terms than we do that of the artist. And I think one of the things that was the interesting byproduct of COVID was when people could do nothing except consume culture of certain types, screen culture, they started to realize just what a big part that plays in your life. If that's missing, it does have a monetary value. It does have a real, it is a real part of the economy. It's not one of these things that when the Minister of Finance is doing the budget, we go, maybe we'll throw a little bit more money at the arts, but just enough to keep it ticking over, because we wouldn't want to encourage the bastards, because it's not a real part of the economy. It's not a real part of society. And we would say, no, as artists, we are. We work every day just like any other worker does. And we work very, very hard to try to produce intellectual capital, which is entirely plucked from the air. It's abstract. Nobody goes in and gives us this great story about a producer who has optioned a book and he brings a screenwriter in. It's based on a real story, he says, and this one practically writes itself. And the writer takes his pen, he puts it on his notepad, and he holds it up and he lets go of the pen, and it falls down. He goes, "It doesn't seem to want to write itself. I guess I'll have to do it."
Very good. Jean, are we allowed to say friggin' in a public forum? Just checking.
We haven't got any questions yet, but they open up on the chat box.
Michael, what's your sense when you're, particularly when you're teaching? How do you approach the notion of value of an output or an oeuvre, let's call it? If a budding undergraduate is looking at continuing in the vein that they might in the fine arts, for example.
When I was having this conversation with a very good, he's not my student, so I'm quite happy to say he's a really, really talented guy who just opted into ceramics about 3 months ago and has made it his degree show. Thanks to another colleague's very excellent work. And I had to say, we were talking about pricing and value and monetary value in this case. And as is always the case with recent graduates or people about to graduate, they massively underprice their work. I'm sure, Gwen, in your teaching experiences, you encounter that too. So the joking approach is just to say to the student, add a zero. I don't mean to be glib about that, but we had this chat with this his marks are being agreed today. But we had a chat about the price of his work, and I just got him to break down what it actually costs for him to make it in terms of the materials, in terms of the firings. It was a mixed media piece with 3D printed elements and wood. And before he was making a profit, it was costing £400 a piece. So that without breaking, and he had no intention of putting a price anywhere near that. So then I go into a conversation about, hourly rates, minimum wage, different rates all the way through the sort of salary scales. And you see, and we run modules, maybe this is a helpful answer as well. We run entrepreneurial and professionalism modules throughout, as every undergraduate visual arts program does, so that you kind of prepare the student for that. But really, we came up with a valid price of that piece, which was £750, which he couldn't believe. But once we broke it down, I suppose, obviously we've touched on, intellectual value and sort of cultural value and material value, but really, it's that kind of departure point where the graduate really needs to take stock of what the monetary value is. And it's about having the courage to say, sorry, that is £2,500 or euros. That's what it costs, because it took me this long. That's what it cost me. Let's not forget the gallery's on a 60%, 70% commission. So if that price tag to the customer says 5,000, and Hugh touched on percentages as well, the artist isn't going to see 40, 30% of that, So there is, I think there's a massive, and Hugh, I think you touched on it as well, there's this perception of value and this perception of what the object or the artifact or the moving image or the performance piece, it's engaging, it's entertaining, we love it. And culturally, I took a quick look there, the craft sector in the UK earned £3.4 billion last year. So it's very, very valuable. But I think what Hugh is touching on as well is this isn't trickling down to the maker. It's not trickling down to, it's going to all these other places before it comes back to the actual author of the work. And that's, I suppose, we're trying to build that from the bottom up with graduates to say, no, if you're underselling yourself now, you're damaging everyone else in the sector. So value, cultural, monetary, they are entwined. And I think, again, this idea that, they're talented, so they're on a whole other world, and that world isn't about making money and paying bills. It's about drifting through life, making beautiful things or sounds or songs. And that's as a great book on Ireland and the arts, Tim Pat Coogan, was published in the 70s. For the artists and craftsmen, a period of disaster was how the 50s, 60s and 70s were described in Ireland. And that's the language he chose to use, but a period of disaster. And I think we have some legacy problem there, that we're not seeing that trickle down sense of monetary value in the creative sector. Yeah.
That possibly, just to conclude, I'll ask you one more question, and just to deliberate on the idea that Ireland doesn't really have, and this possibly underpins the kind of porous nature of how we define the creative industries, if you like. But there doesn't seem to be a central repository of data which puts a value on the contributions of the different verticals within the creative industries. You know, there might be a separate research paper on the film industry, but based on the tax incentives. There might be one through the Design and Crafts Council based upon, you know, the gross value output of design to the industry and so on. And there might be one, a very, very specific niche one, even, if you like, on the fine arts. But there's no consolidated view of what the value of the arts generally and cultural industries are, if you take software and the technology space out of it. So how do you think, or do you think the introduction of such a consolidated kind of collection of data points will help to copper fasten or form a more cohesive government strategy or policy towards how we define value, which ultimately can help the kind of intellectual power generating this value?
I think that there's a lot to be said for that. This issue about collecting data points is actually really important, and certainly surprisingly, data is actually not so easily obtainable in our sector. We're trying to do a little bit more, but this idea about what the value of the creative economy is always massively underscaled, because by and large politicians, the political class, come from very traditional backgrounds and law, accountancy, business, and I think a lot of the thinking, and I think what's really refreshing about being invited to participate in this seminar, and an awareness that at a third level, educators are looking at the creative economy and trying to examine that and prepare students for that, is very welcome, is precisely this idea that, for example, in our business, the big shift that the state agency that has a responsibility for the screen industry, which is Screen Ireland, has made a very deliberate calculation to move away from simply supporting what are sometimes called blow-in productions that take advantage of our tax credit system to make content here, which does provide real jobs in the economy, which is great, but it doesn't create value, long-lasting value. Value is created by the creation of intellectual property by the writer, which is then sold on to the production company. And you alluded, Brendan, to the relationship on both sides of this equation. Can they exist? And they can, I believe, having worked in both parts of it, is recognizing that a writer and a producer are not contractor and contractee, which is the way they're traditionally seen. It's like, I write a script, you like the script, you buy it or option it. Take an option to buy it, and then you make the production, and we all go our way. But once you have made that contractual relationship, you as the producer essentially tell the writer how to develop the material, and that is fine when you have a really good working relationship. Sometimes, very often, that relationship is misunderstood, and people don't necessarily allow the artist to fully express themselves. What a good producer does is they take the work and they don't try to mutate it into something other than what the artist intended, the writer intended it to be. They simply use their market awareness to say, if this was a happy ending, it would be easier to finance, but you may not want to do that. Or if you've written a script which takes place in 1984, but I actually think that all the themes that you have presented in this work are equally viable today. But if you leave it in 1984, it becomes a period work, and that will carry a price tag of another 25%, which will be harder to raise the finance for. So you might want to think about that creatively before I take that to market and see whether or not I can finance that proposition. So just backtracking very slightly and very briefly, there is a move to encourage Irish producers and writers to create intellectual property which will be retained in this country. And that is ultimately of value not only to the economy, but also to the ongoing cultural economy of the screen industry, because it retains more profitability as opposed to being a service operator. And that definitely is an important thing when you recognize that, for example, in America, the entertainment business, now I'm talking about music and television, the whole 9 yards, is the 4th largest business in America. That's pretty amazing. You know, and I actually believe the creative economy, specifically the screen sector, could, I think there are a number of reasons to believe that the screen sector could become enormously, both culturally relevant. We project soft power. When you make stories and you get them out in the international market, you project a vision, a worldview of what it is to be Irish, and national identity is expressed in the work that has a value. It also has a direct value in terms of tourism, but also in terms of our diplomatic power. And it also creates real wealth. So.
Gwen, what do you think? I mean, the design space is slightly more structured as a commercial proposition in a sense because of the traditional kind of manufacturing supply chain components to it. But from the perspective of a creator within that space, do you think government could be doing more to help copper fasten value as it's created? Intellectual value, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I am a big believer in the power of data and evidence to change the conversation fundamentally overnight, you know. And I think if I speak just from my own perspective, there's a real lack of understanding across the textiles and fashion industry about not only the current state of play and all of the, let's say, the challenges dotted across the value chain, but also kind of when you can start to then use data to make projections about different versions of the future, I think that's where it gets quite interesting. So to give you an example, I mean, you know, we could look in Ireland at any single kind of part of the textiles value chain. We have a huge challenge around wool at the moment. Wool is, you know, across the board just really undervalued as a biomaterial that is naturally being generated across the country, but that is essentially valueless and largely being, you know, destroyed. All of the wool products that we produce by and large within Ireland in terms of textiles are coming from New Zealand or from Australia in terms of the raw fiber. So we don't actually use the wool that we develop on the island. And, you know, to have that kind of comparative case whereby you could say, okay, but this is what it would look like if we were to actually build the kind of technology and the infrastructure here on the island of Ireland to be able to utilize the wool that's naturally being generated rather than having this import dependency. And not only in terms of the kind of the economic kickback of that, in terms of the jobs that would be created, or as the brand value. I love what you say about the soft power of national identity. I mean, to be able to really say that this is Irish grown wool has a power, but then also in terms of the life cycle assessment, so the environmental impact of that compared to what we're currently doing. And I think there's, you know, it's that silly saying that I hate, but it's true that when you can measure something, you can manage it. But I think we need to also keep in mind that what we categorize as value needs to be a quite broad definition. And my worry would be that the moment you start to speak through money, you know, you lose something that is essential to the creative industries, which is that intangible value. And that's the challenge, because you need to speak the language, but instantly you make everything commensurate, which is, as we know, not the case. But I mean, something that just strikes me here as well is having these conversations across these different disciplines. I'm finding incredibly enlightening, because I'm hearing so much from what both of the other speakers are saying that is triggering kind of my own thinking about what designers need to do differently. And there's so little space for that, this kind of interaction. So just more of a thank you actually to the organizers. And I wonder, is there also a platform needed to bring these conversations together on the long term?
Thanks, Gwen. Creative Futures could be one particular platform. There could be a little spin-off from that particular initiative.
If I may, Brendan, we just
yes.
had a question from one of our participants. Was wondering, what are your views around the future of AI within the industry, the creative industry and the economy, and
Okay,
the issue of intellectual property.
Michael, you're allowed to answer that. But you have to be polite now. No cursing.
Put on my mic. I would like to comment on your question first, if I may, Brendan,
Sure.
because, you know, I kind of, new documents, new information for government, will it make a difference? And then I just thought, well, governments keep changing. So you're trying to promote something to a particular minister, and then, you know, I'll give you an example. Project I was heavily involved in from 2014 to 15, sorry, 13 to 18. And I remember at the start saying, I really hope everyone who's in the room today will be in the room when we finish this, because we need to build this rapport. We need to build this kind of connection and professional trust and integrity. And in the evolution of that project, which did work, and tremendous support from the OPW, I would point out, no one else was in everyone was new by the time we got to the end. So I think there is that, you know, who I don't want to say we report to, but if we're writing new documents, you know, are these, you know, who's reading them seems to constantly rotate and change. So you build a rapport, and then with that particular department, and then there's a reshuffle and you start again. I think that's I don't know how you fix that, but certainly I think there's value in gathering that information. In terms of AI, it's a very, very new thing for us, I suppose, as a maker. I suppose you could tap AI into 3D printing, and you could kind of, one of the big PhD topics we look at in visual arts research, which is kind of new, because PhDs through studio practices it's not brand new, but it's sort of I think it's newer than other areas of investigation. But the authorship of 3D printing, the kind of the maker's quality, in terms of the heritage of and traditions of making, I don't see AI as a issue yet, but I do see it becoming an issue in terms of critical writing, critical text-based submissions, all of those things. Although it does really, you know, I've encountered it, and it does really look, it's when you're reading something, it sounds like somebody was playing the cello and they've switched to the bass guitar. There's this massive shift in the content of what's being written, and you know, obviously we have ways to screen that, but AI hasn't been a massive issue to date in my discipline.
Gwen, I'll ask both of you quickly for your views on that, because it's already having a huge impact on both your sectors. So last word to you both. Gwen, what do you think in terms of AI and the effect it's going to have on?
I mean, my worry is that we could pontificate for the next 3 hours about the effect it's going to have, but we actually don't know, because I think it's just moving so fast, and the indirect knock-on effect, in the same way that, you know, social media, it had a set of promises that it was going to connect us all and give us, you know, more tailored content and but then the side effects, the larger societal side effects of anxiety and loneliness and polarization and, you know, political systems being, I mean, we just don't know yet, and it is moving definitely into the creative and visual fields very quickly. I saw a competition just in the last few weeks, won by an AI generated photograph, which then of course the applicant quickly came out and said that was AI generated. I was trying to make a point, you know, the creative industries are not ready for the kind of disruption that it's going to cause, and we need to have more effective systems to capture it. And I think regulation is going to be really key. And you know, within the fashion textile space, it has huge possibility, of course, as well, you know, and there's already a lot of AI being used to capture and generate and inform trends, which could be a great thing in terms of, you know, perhaps on-demand production and making sure that we only produce things that people actually need and want. But also you see that it's really being kind of hijacked by hyper fast fashion to very quickly be able to identify trends and churn out product accordingly. So there's, of course, there's pros and cons. And I think the worst thing we can do is to kind of say, let's wait and see. I think we kind of need to try and get ahead of it while we can. And from an educational perspective, that's incredibly difficult because, you know, this is something that even the people who are building these technologies don't truly understand. There's some fascinating research around that that's just been released saying that I think it's 10% of the people who are building these kind of the current generation of AI say that they feel like it will, that humans will lose control of it. So even within that community, there's a lot of uncertainty about how it's developing. So yeah, that would be my 2 cents.
Very good. Hugh, last word to you on that note. And actually, how can we be sure that it's really you, Hugh? And not a deep fake Hugh?
Because the deep fake version of me would be much more interesting than I am.
They would like PowerPoints, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe. When you brilliantly captured exactly my sensibility, but articulated it brilliantly and succinctly, all I would add to the party is 2 small notes, and it's this. The first thing is that there is a big issue here that AI happens because it uses a large language model, right? Which is millions and millions and millions of samples of words, texts, and now images and moving pictures to synthesize these new creative, quote unquote, works. That's done without the permission of the creatives who created that. That's a big problem. There is essentially there is a loophole in the copyright law because nobody imagined this is how AI would work. That has allowed large companies to essentially go through non-copyright pieces of literature and some copyrighted living authors and living artists whose work is sampled. So there is a big issue about if somebody says, write me a novel in the style of well, let's say a living author, a well-regarded living author, or a visual artist, produce a painting or a ceramic or a piece of design in the style of, and it has sampled from the large language model these works, and it appropriates that without permission and synthesizes a new reality. I think that's very problematic. The second thing I would say on a slightly more hopeful note is that many people who've tried ChatGPT have remarked on the one hand, it's amazing what it can do, but it's still not great. It's still a bit funky, and we shouldn't underestimate how quickly the pace of change will go. But I would say on a more hopeful note that Microsoft Word have had a spell check for 20 or 25 years, and it still misspells words in my thing. So there are certain things that you just can't teach a robot because it can't really understand anything. Yeah. It's just synthesizing. And my hope is that the stories that we tell are so uniquely are unique to our humanity. And the way in which we choose to tell them in visual images is unique, that we as humans will recognize in just the same way as we can say there's no harm in mass producing mugs, but we must appreciate the value of ceramic art. And we know the difference between mass production and the artisan work, and that we put a commercial value on that allows artists across all genres to prosper. There's no guarantee about that, unfortunately.
Well, listen, Hugh, on that note, rest assured we won't be taking you for mugs anyway. Thank you very, very much for your contributions this afternoon. Right on target, 2 o'clock, drop dead finish. I really appreciate your time. Michael Moore, Gwen Cunningham, Hugh Farley. Enjoy the rest of the day, and hope you've enjoyed listening to our panelists, everybody out there. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Cheerio.